The modern international is woven from many small ideological associations into one monolith, called globalism. The basis of its birth was the maturation of the working class in the struggle for its rights. In the field of opposition to capital and the bourgeoisie, it was adapted to the needs of the proletariat, the ideological leadership of which was headed by true warriors for the needs of the working people. It was born within the masses themselves through the same disadvantaged labor collectives. In Tsarist Russia, they were called Soviets. Later, when this clan carried out a coup d'état, when it became clear about its victory and its ability to retain power, all sorts of renegades and champions of revolutionary transformations began to make their way into these labor collectives, into these Soviets, and the farther from 1917, the more of them became people who did not have their own convictions, who were prone to privileges emanating from the authorities, were absorbed into the ranks of all sorts of sycophants and scum without family and conscience. The foundations of the ideas of social equality, freedom and the will of the people were completely replaced by the dictatorship of the proletariat. In the worst version of the dictatorship of Tsarism, with a vertical of power and the absence of the will of the masses, only slogans and falsehoods remained. A complete redistribution of the essence of the Soviets resulted in bloody cleansing of the entire former RSDLP. Bolshevism stood at the head of Tsarism, taking on new outlines. For several years of bloody battles, both on the battlefield and in the offices of power, these champions, these sycophants, managed to put under their control a well-coordinated agent network of the British aristocracy. The fragmented Tsarism of Russia could not allow the eastern borders to be lost from its hands, not to mention its masters from the northern islands of Europe. Although their people, their heirs, had at all times formed the backbone of the Tsarist power in Russia, here, in the Soviets, their ranks were strongly fragmented by the socialist revolution. From 1917 onwards, the true admirers of the transformations of wild capital in the structures of the Soviets clashed with the hidden agents of Tsarism in the corridors of power. Now, with the death of its cementing leader and the complete devastation of savage capitalism, the times of bloody terror for ranks and posts in the hierarchy of the Soviets have come throughout Russia. Further, such a bloody ousting of one by another from the ranks of the bureaucracy in the power of Moscow will spill over into a bloody clash of these two world systems throughout the continent. It will be called World War E. The harsh, savage capitalism of the 19th century, with its merciless exploitation of the working class, has sprung up the sprouts of confrontation between a small circle of people of capital and the lower echelons to a new level. The confrontation between past generations of labor and capital collapsed into something larger and unpredictable. The struggle of the proletariat became more and more organized and large-scale. Ideological fighters for freedom, equality and fraternity, who separated from the labor collectives, became uncompromising inspirers of socialism. It implied the withdrawal of the instruments of production from capital and their redistribution into the hands of the workers. At the same time, the main occupation of the capitalists was the extraction of rent. The owners of factories and plants were interested only in profit, and, as you know, it was based on the right of ownership. Guarantees of the authorities for the observance of this principle implied the presence of their people in the corridors of this power. As in all centuries, rich and very rich families could not leave to chance the election of top officials to the centers of state decision-making. The survival of their enterprises depended on the promotion of their own interests in legislation. To put it simply, big capital could not leave the elections to the echelons of power over the people to chance. Investments in real estate accounted for the lion's share of their investments, and if populists or uncontrolled persons with the slogan "Take away and divide" are elected to the main positions in the state management structures, the export of this capital becomes problematic. As a result, the risks of loss increase repeatedly. Therefore, regardless of the choice of the popular masses of their officials, capital and its owners reserve the ability to influence both elected and appointed top officials. Through their agents, the so-called lobbyists become preferable to all others who lobby the interests of their bosses in the structures of the state in real time. By the 50s of the 20th century, the international in the corridors of power in Moscow was firmly entrenched and spread its influence throughout the world. Now it was in the strong hands of agents of Tsarism, retrained as Soviet communists. Moscow became the center of the international, from which ideological, economic, and financial threads stretched literally to all continents. In the Soviets there is not a single true champion of the working man left. All the ideological revolutionaries were ground up by the very system of Tsarism. Remade in a new way. Now Tsarism began to be called the socialist commonwealth. Everything was shifted to the left. Everything was totally subordinated to the vertical of power of Tsarism. The structures of Asian Tsarism at this time stage were remade into the Soviet International, with a struggle against the bourgeoisie, while remaining within the same framework as it was born by the Sumerian civilization. Rigid subordination of the bureaucracy from top to bottom. Lack of choice and complete atrophied expression of the will of the masses. Everything that was assumed by the biosystem of the heirs of the Egyptian courtiers. Proponents of internationalism among nations generally believe that people should come together across national, political, cultural, racial, or class differences to advance their common interests, and that governments should cooperate because their mutual long-term interests are more important than short-term differences. Like everything else, the international was alive and moving. At some times it rallied many times, and at other times, it peacefully flowed through the gutters of the brains of pseudo-communists, loosening it. Over the past decades, the international has radically taken on new shapes. His central committee, from a magnificent and measured life, spent in luxury and pleasure, became completely incapable of distinguishing reality from fiction. By the 80s of the 20th century, it had completely atrophied, as the Roman establishment once was. And this is where the European system of values managed to bring its people to the Central Committee of the CPSU, with a few staunch champions of the Greek archon's ideas, and for a couple of decades, they managed to destroy this monster of internationalism. Since the 1990s, the decision-making center of the entire international system has been subjected to a total cleansing. The declared system of values could not afford a military solution, for the expression of a person's choice is on a par with his own life, with his happiness. The bloodshed of the same people, in whose name these transformations are conceived, was not a priority of the biosystem of democracy. It could only afford this in open defense. The international of the whole world was left an orphan in connection with the systematic collapse of the Soviet state. The blow dealt to Tsarism in the USSR was total, but not fatal. The daughter branches of this Tsarism, embodied in internationalism on a global scale, were again woven into a single whole. His central committee crossed the boundaries and embodied the Democratic Party of the United States. The ideology of socialism, having degenerated into globalism with abundantly irrigated various ideas of uniting people, rose again, spreading its wings. Now multiculturalism has been added to it with its diversity of all cultures and traditions in one society, such as salad bowl or blanket made of patches of all kinds of colors and colors of ethnic cultures. This implied the mixing of all peoples into one multicultural society, where everyone would feel ethnically belonging to his own ethnos, and at the same time respect the aspiration of others. By the 10 years of the 21st century, the top ideologists of Tsarism will easily be able to reformat the ideas of ethnicity and respect for other ethnic groups under the foundations of their subordination, under the foundations of the elevation of one over another on the principle of divide and rule. Tsarism was transferred to party structures, where the autocracy began to be called the party elite or the central committee of the party. It was revived as the most powerful ideological weapon of the biosystem of Asian Tsarism, on a par with the birth of Christianity or Islam in the old days. Oligarchs and their viceroys in top positions in the states of the world perceived this as a solution to the next global problems. All kinds of crises overlapped, and this led to the degradation of the entire world trade. But each world biosystem perceived it in its own way. Before we go any further, let's move on to the specific goals of each of the world's families. Otherwise, the gap made now will not allow us to understand the full essence of the further actions of these clans. The Anglo-Saxon family, or the rulers of the biosystem of the will of the masses, understood that modern Christian civilization, having made a circle in evolutionary terms, was approaching the final death. It no longer met the aspiration of social cohesion and could not unite peoples, especially young people who had grown up on new technologies. The very concept of faith in the times of total education in the sciences led to the rejection of God's creation, the God-chosen man. Theoretical physicists and scientists of other subjects became the main popularizers of the foundations of the universe. There, man was considered as one of thousands of individuals evolving on the planet. This was the main threat to Christianity. The next threat was expressed in the unbridled and permissive nature of the members of the papacy. The wealth of the cardinals themselves and the agent networks of the rival Afro-Asiatic family, which have infiltrated its structures in recent decades, have become a brake on the development of their ideology in adaptation to modern realities. In addition, preparing for the squandering or dispersion of Christian dogmas, the Anglo-Saxon family itself began to feed various kinds of gender concepts, which accelerated the process of demarcation of the old ideology. At the same time, the process of multiculturalism intensified with the announcement of all sorts of revolutions in the countries of the Maghreb and the Middle East, which increased the number of refugees, demography in the countries of Christian culture, and to zero. With such trends, it could remain in a dozen years a country of the old than infirm. This was the third threat, to go on the run from their country. It was mainly young and strong people who needed meager expenses in the form of language training. All this was planned to be replaced in parallel by the common democratic values of one family or community on the basis of one single legal field. At the same time, these revolutions resolved the issue of keeping their people in the establishment of Syria, since the Afro-Asiatic clan dispersed the new Arab caliphate there. To allow them to unite meant to face even greater problems in Western Asia. The clan of Syria, along with the clans of the Bearded in Iran, served to maintain its balance in the Middle East. In parallel with these actions, the Arab Spring began to be fueled to destroy the political monopolies of the Afro-Asiatic family. In the northern countries of Africa, over the past 50 to 60 years, all this has been slowly but surely introduced into the life of Christian and bordering Islamic states. For the Afro-Asiatic family or the biosystem of Tsarism, the moral destruction of the Catholic Church has always been desired. For thousands of years, it subjected the bearers of this ideology to various kinds of alterations and always received a response from the papacy in the form of inquisitions and the preaching of universal values of religion. With the emergence of socialist views in Christian societies, the ideology of Marx and Nietzsche, social inequality, led them to adopt these dogmas. It took decades for their agents of a lower profile to expand and deepen this concept in the minds of the people. Revolutions and wars eventually led to the creation of a world international. Leading it, these heirs, the builders of state structures, led the peoples to a bright future. At least, that's what they promised. That the real goal remained the same: to annoy competitors in the world market, to intercept the flows of capital and rent. By the end of the 20th century, that multiculturalism, launched mainly by the European elite, became a tempting idea of being intercepted by Asian Tsarism when subordinated to its interests. From the past decades, the heirs of the socialists and adherents of communism still remained in the positions granted to them. The global socialist commonwealth, the last years of the 20th century, were not in vain for the reformatting and transfer of corrupt agents of the Anglo-Saxons in the capitals of Europe to their foundations. And now, at the turn of the millennium, a flood of people, including hundreds of recruited both ideologists of Egyptian gods and useful idiots, flooded the European continent and the entire Christian world as a whole. Multiculturalism, where everyone had to remain with their own identity with the same common rules of behavior, now found permissiveness and rejection. The settlers who flooded Europe and America became the most fierce preachers of new views, coupled with Islam, or rather, the old ones, but adjusted by the leaders of Tsarism to the new realities. Contradictions in the cultural code of upbringing and free-floating gave rise to antagonism and enmity. According to the ideologists of Europe, the mental difference of the Southerners could be reborn into a common European culture. This would have happened if the ideology of multiculturalism had not been intercepted by world competitors. As at all times, the lack of time, the venality of the top bearers of the ideas of freedom and will, imprisoned in the framework of the law, and the arrogant heirs of the kingdoms, became a break coupled with the ideas of the international. The weakness of the Anglo-Saxon mega-capitalists was dictated primarily by the breaks in the chains of influence on their top agents. In the power structures of the countries of Christian civilization, lobbyists for the Anglo-Saxons, or simply to say sycophants, over the years of peaceful pastime have achieved material saturation, pampering, complete apathy and possibly schizophrenia. Some of them, in positions that were obliged to ideologically drive the new rivals, were bought out by competitors Afro-Asiatic gold, poison, and dagger also remained in demand for the recruitment of top agents. The pressure to process the refugees arriving on the shores of Europe weakened by an order of magnitude, and the couple was completely curtailed. There were also such managers in the centers who openly preached the values of the Afro-Asiatic family. Due to the lack of education of lobbyists of the first sublevel, and the perception of the given algorithms literally, without having their own civilizational points of support, everything was mixed into one ball. For such individuals, in the crown of whom a passion for a luxurious life had grown, a complete disqualification was required. In addition, in the transfer of key posts in the United States to the Democrats, destructive trends for their capital around the world intensify, and with bringing his Republican, there was simply not enough time to settle down and correct. With Trump's arrival in the White House in 2024, having strengthened his team from the previous cadence of 2016 to 2020 in advance, and having clearly clarified his goals, the situation began to change towards strengthening the position of freedom and will. Having become the head of the visible part of the Anglo-Saxon establishment, they had to go back a little. They rejected the ideas of multiculturalism and returned to the sermons of the old formation, to Christianity, to universal human values, the cornerstone of which is the law, which was much more reliable. So, we concluded that one clan of Northerners or Anglo-Saxon families adopted the concept of multiculturalism in order to smoothly transfer the entire society to the rails of the legal field, where the preaching of faith in God would become even looser along with gender, Muslim, and other dogmas. In their opinion, in a dozen years or a generation, in the former Christian world, or at least in Europe, the concept of respect for all ethnic groups, ideas, communities united on the basis of common laws of universal human values will prevail. In short, the legal field tomorrow will completely cover the Europeans with the blanket that has been woven today, and the threat of socialist transformations will disappear by itself. But, like many times in history, their ideas were remade for their own interests and adopted by the Southerners. From the very beginning of the spread of the International, these perceived it as the destructive force of all the structures of the opponents. Attempts to bleed the capital of the Visigoths with ideas of general equality on the threshold of the 21st century were crowned with some success. With the transfer of the helm in the White House to the Republicans, their protective mechanisms worked in the form of replacing the central pillar of the state or the law with all kinds of dogmas of cultural, mental, gender equality. For further reflections, let's figure out who, and what forces directly affect the visible policy of states. To do this, let's summarize what has been said. By the end of the 20th century, the economies of almost all states became dependent on each other. Global unification in invisible chains of lobbying for logistics and finance led capitalists all over the world to join action. The interests of the ruling classes throughout the history of productive farms have been collapsing into a single framework of violence for decades. This gave rise to several levels of capital and capitalists. The most significant capitalists in our table are at the highest level. These are multi-billionaires or even mega-multi-billionaires. There are not so many of them in the world, and they are united in families on the basis of a national ethnos, on the basis of the code of identification of the place from which their ancestors were born. Now there are two dominant families left in the world: Afro-Asiatic and Anglo-Saxon family. Family in the sense of one ingot, one interest. Almost no one knows them by sight, or they know them as they will be presented as they are, under the guise of any position or name. They are the owners of banking conglomerates and multinational corporations. They are located on the plateau of civilization. These are the main spiders, on whose decisions the entire system of economics and politics of the entire civilization rests. Without their approval or disagreement, no global changes in the world will occur, because they are investors of the highest rank. The first level is just below the top level, many of which are within the immediate reach of members of the upper elites, millionaires who have inherited from their ancestors, and those who, according to their abilities, have joined their family due to circumstances and opportunities. Over the past decades of industrialization of economies, with the age of electronics and computerization, there are many such rich people. These people are dependent on spiders in terms of investments. Joint projects unite them more strongly, and the struggle with the competing family unites them into a single ingot of confrontation. They form the basis of their family's gold club. People of the highest and first levels are the masters of the planet and the suzerains, the feuds of the lower. The second level is the rich of top management. They mainly serve the former as top managers or as lobbyists for their interests. The overwhelming majority of decisions go to the stage of adoption by legislation. The promotion of these lobbyists, they are scattered among the financial, political, military, and social structures of all states of the world. This is the most numerous class of managers. They are recruited from among those who stand out among the peoples and are zealous in loyalty. Their need and loyalty play a key role. The suzerain pampers them with material values and at the same time hangs over him like a sword. And this level or class is divided into several sub-levels. The highest sub-level is those who are in close proximity to their domain, or the presidents of countries. Their knowledge of life is very high. They are well erudite and negotiable. Their competence is expressed to us as if we were seeing a philosopher, a scientist. After them, the first sub-level, which is in the governments of different countries, under top positions such as ministers or judges, as well as the military and intelligence. And the second sub-level, they mainly sit in parliaments. Their fees depend on their diligence in service, and they are considerable. They fall into the camp of lobbyism due to their character and upbringing. In these structures, they organize their parties, their clan associations of local importance. The heads of these parties are on full board. Of all the levels, the first and second sub-levels of lobbyists are considered the most volatile. This layer is most prone to betrayal, with a change of regime or turbulence of power. This class of sycophants strives to switch to a competing world family, depending on who takes over. Their venality in the bloodiest years is off the charts, but the mortality rate among them is not small. In modern conditions, the physical death of such a lobbyist has become unproductive. They, simply plucked to the skin, are released on all four sides. The rest of their lives in poverty, by their standards, better than any punishment, acts in the service of the remaining sycophants. Such a system, built since the destruction of the Bronze Age, both by Afro-Asiatic oligarchs, Egyptian pharaohs with priests, kings of the protostates of the Middle East, and by the Greek and Roman, then by the Normans and Visigoths, and finally by the Anglo-Saxon tribal leaders, over the centuries has become a monolithic, strong, structured biological system of subordination, control and punishment. Over hundreds of decades, she has grown up, matured and become very, very rich. The first merchants, at the time of the deaths of the clan communities, which proudly stood before their ethnos with a dozen animals, could not even imagine what enormous proportions their accumulations would reach, and what would be the result of their activity in commercial operations. The beginning of the influence on all subsequent events in the significant world was laid precisely when this merchant, cattle breeder decided to move from the content of goats to the sale and resale of the first goats, produced by someone. I think we have figured out how the modern political side of the world establishment works. Now let's talk about the ideological component of this establishment. We owe the emergence of ideological weapons to the same heirs of capital. Just as the exploitative streak was preserved in the relations between slave and his owner, feudal lord and serf, capital and worker, so was the ideology of faith in God in the Creator. Both of these components, the state, capital on the basis of private property and the ideology of faith, were accepted by the ruling class as a single whole. They have supported and strengthened each other for centuries in order to create, increase and preserve wealth. Two of the most important structures were implanted in the matrix of violence, which humanity cannot give up to this day.